HDR, or high dynamic range photography, is a post-processing technique whereby a photographer takes a series of different exposures of one scene and then combines them all to create one photograph. As a result, HDR images contain a greater range of tonal detail closer to that of the human eye, which unfortunately just can't be captured in a single photograph. Now, in order to actually capture a perfect series of exposures, you really need to understand contrast ratios. But having said that, you ordinarily need between 3 to 5 different exposures, about 2 stops apart, to create a decent HDR image. So as you can see currently in Adobe Bridge, I have 5 different exposures. There are 2 stops difference between each, and you can see that I've got 2 under and 2 over from the current highlighted standard exposure that was recommended to me by my camera's light meter. Now, once you have your 3 to 5 images, it's time to actually get stuck into post-processing and combining them. Now, there are several different post-processing HDR software on the market, and in this tutorial, I'm going to do a quick comparison between Photoshop's merge to HDR Pro and Photomatix Pro, which is probably the best HDR software on the market at the moment, and you're going to see why in the next couple of minutes. So if I just quickly go to Photoshop, you'll actually find HDR Pro located underneath File, Automate, and down the bottom here you'll see Merge to HDR Pro. So we click on that, and that will bring up the Merge to HDR Pro window. And essentially, all you need to do is click Browse, locate all of your different exposures, select them all, and then click Open. And once you've done that, it's just a process of going and clicking OK to actually start HDR Pro. So once HDR Pro has finished all its processing, you'll notice that the Merge to HDR Pro window will appear. Now, I must admit that Photoshop's HDR Pro doesn't have a wide range of features or options to help you produce an amazing HDR photo from the get-go. And in most instances, you will be required to do a lot of additional editing using Photoshop's exposure and HDR toning adjustments, which can also be extremely fiddly and time-consuming. Now, if we take a walk through this particular window, the first thing you'll notice up in the top right-hand corner is where you find all of your adjustments. So you'll find your presets, you'll find remove ghosts, and then you'll find your actual mode. Now, according to the mode that you set, is actually going to change the type of options that are made available to you within this window. So in most cases, if you wanted to, you'd ordinarily change the mode to 16-bit, which is going to give you a wider range of options to edit your image within this particular window. But if you don't want to, you can actually process your image as a 32-bit image and actually use, as I mentioned earlier, the exposure and HDR toning adjustments within Photoshop to actually adjust your image in order to get a result that you're relatively happy with. So if you do choose to use 32-bit, all you essentially need to do is set the white point preview. So you essentially scroll across the histogram here, and you want to set it to the very edge of your actual detail that's representative in your histogram. So that's about there as far as I can tell. Now, you'll notice also with this image that there is some ghosting around this lavender. And in order to remove that, all you need to do is simply check the remove ghosts. And that's primarily because there's obviously multiple exposures, and with different exposure settings and also weather conditions, things can move within your photograph. And that's why we have the remove ghost setting. And now you'll see that the lavender plant has actually, all the ghosts have been removed, and you're left with one particular image or one detailed area that is pin sharp. So that's really quite neat. Now, essentially, if you're working with 32-bit, as I mentioned, all you need to do now is actually go ahead and click OK, and that'll actually process the image, and then you'll have to be you'll be required to actually do additional work inside of Photoshop to get it looking better than what it currently looks like. So instead of that, I'm going to actually select 16-bit. Now, if you watched in a previous submodule the video on HDR toning, you would have noticed that we went through all of these particular modes and options here, from local adaptation to your highlight compression and whatnot. Now, the main one you really want to utilize is going to be your local adaptation. That's going to give you the most amount of options and controls to actually adjust your image, as you can see here. So that's the one you really want to stick with, and you essentially want to go through and edit the image in order to actually get it to a place where you're relatively happy with. So as you can see there, that looks a lot better than what it did, but it doesn't look like a HDR image to me, because I need to put some more detail into the highlights and probably lighten off the shadows a little bit more, and maybe add a little bit of vibrance or saturation to it. So let's go ahead and do that. I might actually choose to just sort of reduce the gamma, and by reducing the gamma, that's going to actually lower the contrast of the image, as you can see there. So I've retained a bit more detail in the lovely garden chairs there that have some really bright whites in them. And then you can choose to obviously adjust the exposure accordingly to a setting that you're relatively happy with. It doesn't give you an option to look at your histogram, so it's really difficult to tell whether you're actually blowing out your highlights when you're actually adjusting them, unlike that of Camera Raw when you're actually making your adjustments to a raw file. But then you can go ahead and actually choose to specify your shadows and the highlights, so I can actually add in or remove highlight details, so I can add a bit of density to it, which is quite useful. And then I can obviously lighten off the shadows just by adjusting this slider to a place that I'm relatively happy with, and maybe make a few additional adjustments to the exposure. So once you've done that and you're relatively happy with the image, you can essentially click OK, and it'll process it, and you'll end up with a 16-bit image similar to what we're looking at the moment on screen. So as you can see, that's required a little bit of work in order to achieve that particular result. Now, what I'm going to do now is actually show you Photomatix Pro, which actually provides a lot more control, and from what I've found, produces better results quickly with less work, and it's actually far easier to operate than that of Merge to HDR Pro within Photoshop. So let's go ahead and bring up that. So with Photomatix Pro, you'll have this workflow shortcuts window here, and the first thing you want to do is go to Load Bracketed Photos, which will bring up a little window similar to that of Photoshop, where you can actually browse and choose all of your bracketed photos. So once we load those, make sure that you also leave checked Show 32-bit HDR image on, and then we click OK. And the next thing you'll see is you'll have some pre-processing options. And essentially this is going to allow you to select Align Source Images, which you always want to do. That's going to be a default. You want to remove ghosts, similar to that within Photoshop, and you also want to reduce the noise of underexposed images. You can also choose to actually specify whether you want to do that for normal exposed or underexposed images as well. From there, you can also choose to reduce chromatic aberrations, which are those color fringing or color fringes that you see on really fine detail, and that's something that we've gone over within Camera Raw, how to actually adjust those for your raw files. Now, everything else here you primarily want to leave set as the defaults that are provided to you, and then click Pre-Process. So once Photomatix Pro has finished processing all of your bracketed exposures, you'll end up with an image window that will appear. Now, at first it looks pretty terrible, but this is your 32-bit preview. So the next step in this process is actually to go over to your little workflow shortcuts window, and you want to click on Tone Mapping / Fusion. And what will happen then is you'll actually get a series of different options and sliders that will appear for you, plus an actual preview image here, along with a range of presets along the bottom. So this is essentially Photomatix editing suite, as it were. So as you can tell, just straight away with the default settings that are provided for tone mapping within this software, that the image already has a really nice feel to it, and it's already presenting really well. So if you wanted to, you could essentially process this and end up with an image that, you know, you'd be relatively happy with. But you can actually choose to fine tune that, and as you can see here, we have, you know, the strength, color saturation, luminosity, detail, contrast, along with adjusting your white points, your black points, your gamma, your color temperature. So that's really fantastic. That's not inside of HDR Pro in Photoshop. And you can also go ahead and adjust the saturation of your highlights and your shadows. So there's quite a few different options here for you to actually control and get a better process or better pre-processing of your HDR photograph. Along with that, you have all of these presets down the bottom here. If you want to actually adjust it without having to actually adjust any settings, you can do it visually. So I can go in here and go, well, I'd like to use a grunge look, so I can click on that and that'll process it accordingly. And if you want a black and white, you have a black and white version as well. So it all depends on the look and feel of the image that you're actually trying to create. But, you know, just from a starting point, it does a relatively good job. So I'm really pleased with the results that it creates for me. And as you can clearly see just by jumping back to the original, and if I just move this window to what we've got in Photoshop, it's very similar, but I'd have to say overall it actually does a better result. I know it doesn't look as sharp, but you can actually adjust that with inside of Photomatix Pro. So that's sort of a brief comparison of the two different softwares that you can use for processing your HDR images. I hope you've enjoyed that. We're going to go into some more detail in the future with some other examples that I have for you, but until then, have a play with them. You can download the free version of Photomatix Pro, and I'll include a link below this video for you, so you can actually go ahead and do that. It's a free trial. It has everything included, so yeah, go ahead and play with it. Experiment with Photoshop's version as well, and let me know your thoughts. Tell me which one you think is a better HDR processing software.